No whinny. No struggle. Only a horse. Dragged across the auction floor. Head bowed. Eyes shattered as if it had ended its own hope. 10 years. No one dared to touch. No one patient enough to ask. Why does it still stand there, by the fence, every night? Not waiting to be rescued, but waiting for the eyes that once turned away. It remembered. Even after being torn apart. Even after standing on the edge of oblivion. And then, the old figure returned. No reins. No apology. Only carrying a wound that had never stopped bleeding. Eyes met eyes. No forgiveness. No anger. Only a question, colder than any sentence ever passed. This time, will you still turn away? There was no reunion. Only a soul standing between judgment and memory, forcing you to answer. If you have the courage to face that gaze, join me. The story begins. Elias Crane was once a living legend across the western plains. The man who tamed horses with a glance instead of a whip. The man who could make a wild Mustang kneel with nothing but a single deep breath. But life had ridden through him like a storm that owed no explanation. His wife taken by terminal bone cancer. His only son killed in Fallujah. And the Crane Ranch, carried through 3 generations, seized by the bank in under 3 weeks. Since then, Elias disappeared. No headlines. No letters. No trace. People whispered, if anyone ever broke pain in like a wild animal, it was Elias. By letting it devour him in silence. Before dawn. The edge of the Nevada desert. No lights. No sound. Only wind, shrieking through splintered wood like the voice of something never spoken aloud. On a sand-stained road, an old pickup truck crawled forward like an exile returning to the place that burned his past to ash. The headlights cut through the dark, catching glimpses of cacti and twisted branches, like half-remembered shadows of a shattered life. Elias Crane sat behind the wheel, eyes sunken beneath graying lashes. His hands clenched the steering wheel, not to keep control, but to hold on to something slipping through the cracks inside him. A small photo slipped off the dashboard and landed on the floor. In it, a boy laughed, resting his head against the neck of a chestnut foal, his eyes gleaming like he'd never known loss. Elias didn't reach for it. He closed his eyes. One breath, long, deep, and heavy, like a stone sinking in still water. He had been the finest horseman west of Nevada. Until 3 years took everything. His wife to cancer. His son to war. His legacy to foreclosure. After that, he vanished. As if he no longer wanted a name. No friends. No family. No one knew where he'd gone. People used to say horses could sense grief. But Elias left no scent behind. He became invisible even to the souls who walked on iron hooves. And now, he was back. Not to survive, but to face the one thing he couldn't bury. A gaze that had never let him go. 10 years missing. 20 years buried in silence. And now he returned to a place that still reeked of memory. The kind no one dared unseal. Ray's message still clung to the voicemail like dust. There's a horse here. No one can get close. But every night, it just stands by the fence. And I swear, Elias, it's waiting for you. Elias didn't leave because he hated horses. He left because of one. Because a horse was the last living fragment of what he once loved, once lost, and could never save. The weathered gate creaked open. Its hinges moaned like a ghost welcoming him home. Elias drove in slowly, tires crunching dry gravel, like brittle bones breaking underfoot in the dead of winter. The old gray stables emerged. Worn. Isolated. No neighs. No lights. Just wind, cold, and a silence that made a man feel small again. Ray stood at the porch, a lantern casting gold across a face carved by years. "Welcome back to your old hell," he said with a half-smile. "I left the darkness just the way you liked it." Elias didn't smile. He only nodded, eyes drifting past Ray, toward the open field beyond, where shadowed shapes stood still like statues in the night. "There's one horse," Ray lowered his voice. "It stays by the fence, always facing the way you came from. Won't let anyone near. But it doesn't run either. Like it's waiting for something to return. Or someone." Elias didn't move. The wind clawed at his collar. But the cold wasn't from outside. It was from within. A memory, rising again like a howl in the bones. And then, through the thick stillness, he saw them. Eyes. Not bright. Not dull. Not wild. Just deep. Steady. Like they had known him once. Like they remembered being left behind. This wasn't a reunion. It was a reckoning. Between a man and the soul he once turned away from. The horse didn't move. But its eyes stopped time inside Elias. Some souls. All it takes is one wind. And they come back. That night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat alone on the wooden porch, his coffee long gone cold. The moon hung low on the horizon, hazy like a memory covered in fog. In the distance, the herd stirred from time to time, but Rome remained apart, like a sentinel guarding something sacred. That look. The gaze that made Elias's heart slow, as if it had brushed up against an ancient curse. There was no rage. No accusation. Only recognition. And something else. Memory. Elias searched through his past, but the truth was, it had never left. Storm. The first chestnut foal he had ever delivered with his bare hands. No white markings, but with a strange habit of simply looking at him whenever his name was called, as if trying to understand before reacting. Storm had been the soul of the Crane Ranch, until Elias lost everything, and the men came, with papers, and drove the horses away like they were clearing out the past. Storm turned back 3 times as they led him away. No fight. No whinny. Just a look, like he was waiting for Elias to do something. Say something. Stop it. But Elias turned away. And from that day on, he never looked a horse in the eyes again. Ray sat down beside him, slowly, as if afraid to disturb something already breaking. "You think it's Storm?" he asked. Elias didn't answer. Ray gazed out across the field. "I've seen a lot of horses in my life. But that one, it's different. Like someone once spoke to him with their heart, and now, he's just waiting for that heart to come back." Elias set his cup down. His hand trembled. Not from age, but from something deeper than age. "Storm had a small scar under his right eye," Elias said, voice thin like wind through stone. I pulled him out from under a barbed fence once. He never let anyone touch that spot. Except me. Ray stood, saying nothing more. Tomorrow morning, he said. I won't lock the gate. If you want to try. Elias nodded faintly. When he returned to the old room alone, the moon still spilled through the window pane. But the light he saw wasn't from the present. It was from 21 years ago. The last afternoon. The final glance. The question that had never been answered. Can a creature that once trusted you completely ever forgive you for walking away without a word? Elias didn't know. But he knew one thing. That look. This morning. It was Storm's. And if that was true, then everything he had ever buried was coming back. Step by step. Not to destroy, but to ask again, are you still worthy? No one said a word. No words were needed. Elias walked slowly toward the wooden fence. The other horses had been led away. Only Rome remained. Alone. His back turned, but ears alert, as if he heard Elias's footsteps long before they arrived. Ray stood a few dozen yards away. Arms crossed. Silent. He didn't intervene, but his eyes never left Elias. Elias drew a deep breath. There was no confidence left in him. Only one thing left to prove, not to anyone else, but to himself. He stepped inside. No rush. No pause. Each step was a quiet confession. Ron didn't turn. But he didn't walk away either. Elias stopped, just one body's length away. Dust lifted gently beneath his boots. His eyes began to sting. The words escaped, not like a command, but a plea. Storm? Ron froze. His entire body went still, beyond reflex, beyond instinct. His ears twitched. Head lifted. Eyes turned. And then, he turned to face him. Directly. That look? It wasn't Ron's. It wasn't the wild horses. It wasn't from the present. It was Storm's. The foal who had turned back 3 times at the final gate 21 years ago. Waiting for Elias to turn, just once. And Elias hadn't. Now their eyes didn't blink. Neither did their bodies move. And yet the entire stable seemed to go breathless. As if witnessing the unraveling of a sacred truth, long buried. Storm, or Ron, took a single step forward. Slow. Measured. Then stopped, just within reach. And bowed his head. Elias lifted his hand. Gently. His hand trembled. Then, Storm's muzzle touched his fingertips. Soft as breath, but strong enough to bring down every wall Elias had built over 2 decades. He almost said another word, a name, but it caught in his throat. His right index finger began to tremble, the faint scar along its edge still there, where Storm had once nipped him playfully as a colt. And now, that same muzzle touched that very spot. As if time had returned to the one moment when both had forgotten how to forgive. Elias dropped to his knees. He didn't cry, but his chest heaved like a man who had just been undone. That name, no one had dared say it. No one had ever heard it answered. But now, with just a whisper, the whole world held its breath. Ray stepped closer. Slowly. His eyes never left the scene before him. "You're sure?" Elias didn't turn, just nodded. The scar beneath his right eye. "It's still there." Ray said nothing. Even his breath seemed to pause. The wind stirred. The sun rose. Storm stood beside Elias, unmoving. Some reunions need no tears, no proof, just a single look to collapse everything and begin again. No one believes the impossible until it stands before them. The next day, the wind wasn't as cold as the mornings before, but Elias still was on the inside. Storm, or Roan, stood by the fence as if he had never left, as if the past 21 years had never happened. But maybe that's what made it harder, because Elias could feel something still left unspoken, still untouched. He brought an old brush with him, the soft kind. The kind Storm used to love so much he'd lie still for half an hour just to feel it run down his spine. As Elias approached, Roan turned to look. He didn't step forward. He didn't pull away. He just waited. Elias didn't speak his name. He simply held out his hand, palm open, like the old days. Roan stepped forward. His nose hovered over Elias's palm for a breath, then gently licked his index finger. Elias stopped breathing, because that lick, that was the begin signal from long ago. Not instinct, a ritual, one shared between two souls, once bonded. And in that moment, the world faded. There was only a man, a horse, and a promise, once broken. He began brushing, slowly, along the spine. Roan stood still. But when Elias reached his left shoulder, Roan shuddered, just slightly. Elias froze. He looked down. Beneath the hair, a scar. Not old, not fresh, but it hadn't come from the time they'd known together. He placed his hand on it, softly, like touching a memory. Roan turned his head, not startled, just subdued, like he, too, was remembering. Elias whispered, not to Roan, but to himself. "What did they do to you all those years, Storm?" Roan didn't whinny, but he stepped closer, then turned, positioning that scarred shoulder toward Elias, as if giving permission. From a distance, Ray watched it all. He didn't step in. He didn't move, as if held back by something sacred, something only the broken could recognize. Elias resumed brushing, but this time, his hand trembled, not because of the horse, but because of what he now felt inside. "I left you once, and you still came back, wounded by hands not mine, but because I didn't protect you." Roan suddenly turned. His head rested against Elias's chest. Not forcefully, just enough for Elias to feel that breath. The same old breath, still there, even after time had changed everything else. Elias wrapped his arms around the horse's head. He said nothing, but the emotion broke through. Wordless. Only an old instinct. And a new wound. That's where everything began again. Night fell. The small room felt suffocating, heavy with the memories Elias had buried for 2 decades. On the table, the old brush lay still beside a cup of coffee left untouched. But inside his head, nothing was still. Only fragments of the day Storm was taken away. That year, the final afternoon, Crane Ranch was packed. A crowd shoulder to shoulder. People shouting bids. The scent of dry hay mixed with the smell of money. Each horse that stepped onto the auction platform looked like it was walking to its own execution. Storm was barely 2. Eyes wide, still innocent. But sharp. Quiet. And tied to Elias like shadow to body. The dead notice hit the table. Ray, younger than, face pale, whispered, "Elias, if you don't sell more, they'll take the house. The land. Everything." Elias turned away when Storm was led to the block. He didn't watch. Because he knew, if he did, he wouldn't be able to go through with it. But Storm turned back. Once. Then again. And then a third time. No whinny. No struggle. Just a look. As if waiting for someone in the crowd to step out and stop it all. Elias didn't step forward. He still had a wife. A son. A family standing at the edge of ruin. And he chose them. By letting go of Storm. But just 1 year later, his wife was gone. His son, killed in Fallujah. The house, seized after the buyer defaulted. And when Elias finally went looking for Storm, Storm was gone. No papers. No trace. Back in the present, Elias sat on the porch steps. Storm lay a few yards away, head resting on his front legs. The silence was so deep, he could hear the wind brushing through the grass. He spoke. Quiet, but clear. That day, I thought I was doing the right thing. But it turned out to be the worst mistake I ever made. Storm didn't move, but his ear twitched. If you're the dream I left burning half-finished, then I'm ready to let it burn again. Even if this time, I don't know if I can keep it alive. Storm rose slowly, walked toward him. Not fast, not hesitant. Stopped just in front of Elias, as if he had heard everything. Elias closed his eyes. A single drop slid down his cheek. Not a tear, but the last remnant of something he'd held back for far too long. Because some dreams don't die. They just smolder, waiting for someone brave enough to look back and let them burn again. The next morning, before the first sunlight touched the wooden porch, Elias was already standing there, quietly watching Storm, as if waiting for the truth to speak first. He carried with him a damp cloth and an old grooming kit. His hands weren't as steady as they once were, but steady enough to touch every part of the body that once held his soul. When his hand reached the area near Storm's spine, the horse flinched, just slightly. Elias paused, gently parted the thick coat, and froze. Beneath the long mane was a thick callus, the kind left by a saddle cinched too tight for too long. Underneath, a dark, bruised patch stretched toward the shoulder blade. Along the left flank, a small, healing gash. A blade wound. The back heel, swollen. Not fresh, but still aching. Not wounds from wild predators, but from men. Elias sank to his knees. The brush fell from his hand. His throat tightened, as if he'd just swallowed a lifetime of rage. What did they do to you? He whispered, each word grinding through clenched teeth, like he wanted to tear the silence apart. Storm turned his head. He stood there. No flinch. No retreat. Just looked at Elias, with eyes impossibly gentle. Elias's fists clenched. His eyes burned, but not at Storm. At the past. At the men who dragged horses like carcasses. At himself. For staying silent while it happened. Arched spine, tucked legs, tangled mane, shifted shoulders. And still, you stand here and walk toward me? Storm took another step, pressed his forehead gently into Elias's shoulder, not to take anything back, but as if he had forgiven long ago. Elias rested his head against the horse's neck. This time, his hand moved along the spine, not to fix, but to feel. Because some cuts aren't on the skin. They're in the places where a horse still chooses to step toward you, even knowing who let go first. And sometimes, forgiveness doesn't need an apology. Just one step toward the one who once turned away. Night felt like a heavy blanket draped over the prairie. No wind, no insects, nothing but the steady, quiet breath of the earth itself. Elias didn't sleep. Neither did Storm. The two stood by the old wooden fence, saying nothing, moving even less, as if listening to the same distant voice. Elias stepped closer, slowly. The moon cast their shadows into one, man and horse, both shaped and misshaped by time. He brought no bridle, no saddle, nothing at all. Just a bare hand, trembling softly, from age, and from what was still unsaid. Elias laid his hand on Storm's chest, where the heartbeat pulsed slow, steady, and strong, like the cadence of an old marching drum. No reaction. Storm simply closed his eyes and stood still. It wasn't the behavior of a wild horse. It was the answer of a soul, hearing an apology that needed no words. Elias closed his eyes, too. His hand remained on Storm's chest. And in that silence, something inside him broke open. But it didn't hurt. Not a breaking that shatters, but one that lets something inside finally breathe. No words were spoken, but so much had been said. When Elias opened his eyes, Storm was still there, the moonlight catching on his eyelids. A glint that could have been light, could have been tears, or perhaps acceptance. And that was enough. Some conversations need no language, only a heartbeat held long enough for two lost souls to find where they still fit inside one another. That night, no one slept, but for the first time in years, Elias didn't feel alone. The sky had not fully brightened. The air was wrapped in a thin veil of mist, like the last breath of night still lingering. Elias opened the door to the old tack shed. The hinges creaked. The sound of time that never forgives. In the corner, buried in dust and cobwebs, was the one thing he once swore he'd never touch again. The old saddle. He didn't clean it, didn't polish it. He simply picked it up, as if lifting not a saddle, but an entire life left behind. Storm was waiting. He hadn't wandered, just stood there in the pale morning fog. No halter, no rope, no fence, Elias stepped closer. His hands placed the saddle onto Storm's back, the way he once did in his youth. Every movement slow, like a ritual of atonement. Storm didn't flinch, didn't pull away, didn't take a sharp breath. He simply lowered his head, as if to say, "I remember this." Elias tightened the cinch. His heart pounded, not from fear of falling, but from the fear he might no longer deserve to sit where he once called home. He placed a boot into the stirrup. 1 second. 2. And then he mounted. No hoofbeats. No sudden turn. Storm stood still, like a pillar of memory in the middle of the world. Elias laid his hand on Storm's mane, and for the first time in 21 years, he whispered, "We are still one." Storm stepped forward, slowly, each stride a slice through time. Old dirt, old grass, old wind, but the feeling, never old. There are saddles that carry more than a rider. They carry remembrance. Because if a soul that once carried you through storms is still standing, then no one was ever truly left behind. Elias sat tall, eyes fixed on the horizon, and Storm began to trot. No command, no instruction, just two old souls who had never forgotten each other's rhythm. That night, the moon rose early, full and bright, as if the sky itself wanted to hold this moment a little longer than usual. Elias sat in the saddle, hands loose, letting Storm choose the path. No words, no pressure, but both understood. They were riding through memory. A small hollow appeared at the base of the hill, where the grass grew soft and the wind moved gently. Elias gave the reins a light pull. Storm stopped. Stillness. Elias looked down. Beneath the grass lay a small stone, worn down by years. On it, 2 hand-carved letters, J.C. He didn't speak, but his gaze lingered for a long time. Storm lowered his head, stepped forward, stopped beside the stone. No whinny, no wasted movement. And then, Storm tapped the ground twice with his front hoof. The old signal, the one the boy had taught him. Before every ride, Elias froze, his eyes wide, unblinking. No tears fell. He'd cried them all long ago. But Storm was different. Under the moonlight, a shimmer at the corner of his eye caught the light. Perhaps it was moonlight. Perhaps it was something else. No explanation was needed. Anyone watching would know. This was the place Elias's son once rode Storm on quiet weekend afternoons, and the place where the boy's ashes were laid to rest after the war. A flash of memory surged in. A laughing child, arms wrapped around a young chestnut foal. Storm stood still, letting the boy climb on. They walked, slow, but sure. Elias nearby, one arm extended to catch a fall, his eyes softer than any words could ever be. Then the scene shifted. Bombs, flags, an urn, and Elias emptied of tears. Back in the present, Elias leaned forward, rested a hand on Storm's neck, not to steady him, but to say thank you. Because this horse wasn't just his soul. He had once been a gift. for the son Elias couldn't hold on to. Storm walked forward again. Not fast, but steady. Some losses can't be spoken aloud, but they can be ridden through. Beneath the moonlight, to remember and to forgive. The next morning, Elias rode Storm across the prairie, not by trail, but by memory. They passed through hills once filled with laughter, where children's footsteps once chased the wind, where home used to be. But when they arrived, all that remained was a heap of rotted wood, collapsed tiles, and a few lonesome posts standing in ruin. The old house had been swallowed by time and wind. Storm stopped. No reins pulled him. He simply knew. Elias looked around. The wind blew strong, not cold. But his heart tightened. This had been the land of family meals, of his son's first ride, of shirts folded by a wife waiting for someone to come home. Storm turned his head back, looked straight at Elias. No blink, no wasted motion. That look seemed to ask, "So, what do you choose now? Return to the pain? Or move forward with what's still alive? Cling to a shattered soul? Or build something new from the ashes?" Elias didn't answer with words. He simply gave a small nod. And Storm began to walk again. Late afternoon, the sun sank behind the ridge, leaving behind its last golden threads, stitched across the sky. Elias and Storm stopped on a high ridge. Neither spoke. Neither moved. Each breath carried the weight of something still unnamed. Suddenly, Elias slipped in the saddle, his body swaying, and fell to the ground. No one saw. Only the earth, the wind, and Storm. Storm turned immediately, walked to him, lowered his body gently, laying beside Elias, chest to earth, legs tucked in, his head resting against Elias's shoulder. No whinny, no cry, just breathing and sink. Elias placed a hand on his cheek, and this time it didn't tremble, because for the first time, he wasn't afraid of losing, wasn't afraid of being left behind, because he knew he had never truly been forgotten. They lay there, under sky and soil. One man, one horse, no words, but warmth passed between them like a shared heartbeat. A soul once shattered had found its way home. A body once broken was now touched without pain. And just like that, the final touch no longer trembled. The next morning, on a dew-kissed ridge, Elias sat beside Storm, eyes fixed on the sun-scorched horizon, not searching for anything, just making sure that now he knew what he needed. Ray rode up on horseback, carrying a flask of hot coffee. "You holding up?" he asked. Elias nodded. His eyes never left the prairie. "We'll build a sanctuary," he said, without hesitation. "Not just for Storm, but for the others. The ones sold off, thrown out, treated like garbage, but who still have souls." Ray stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're insane," he said. "But it's the only kind of crazy I've ever trusted." 2 months later, the land that had once been nothing but ashes stood again, with new fences, tin-roofed barns, simple troughs, rough, imperfect. But there was wind. There were hoofbeats. There was life. The horses began to arrive. From rescue shelters. From auctions. Even from people who carried years of shame, now seeking redemption. One came with a missing back leg, limping like he'd never been called by name. Another, blind in one eye, unable to tell light from shadow. Storm became the lead. Not by force, not by title, but because the herd followed him. He didn't teach with a snort, didn't command with hooves. He simply stood, still, calm, and took the first step. The rest followed. Elias watched through the slats of the new fence. His hand clenched. Not in anger this time, but in disbelief that a soul once shattered could now become the anchor for others. One morning, the fog rolled in thick like spilled milk. A foal had just arrived, its body trembling, its legs barely able to hold weight. Rescued from slaughter in a Colorado kill pen. Storm stepped forward. He didn't touch, didn't press, just stood a few paces away. Eyes fixed on the foal, head bowed slightly. Still, the foal collapsed, but then, slowly, pushed itself back up, shaking, mouth trembling. But it took one step, and didn't fall. Elias stood behind the fence, hand over his chest. Tears fell, not from pity, but from revelation. He had once believed only humans could save lives, but now he saw it clearly. Some souls need no words to lead, and sometimes salvation doesn't come from the strong. It comes from the broken, those who have fallen, but never stopped rising. The rumors spread about a horse who came back for his man, about a man who rose again because of a single look. People arrived from everywhere, bringing horses, bringing tears, bringing stories they had never told. And when they left, their eyes were softer, their breaths deeper. One man came with an old horse abandoned in a flood. A young woman led a one-eared pony. It survived the wildfire, she said. But no one wanted her anymore. Elias never asked why. Storm never asked names. But with each new arrival, another door opened on the land that used to be a home. And so, the sanctuary of wild horses was built, not with money, but with hearts that had once been shattered, and still had the courage to beat. One golden afternoon, Elias sat on a flat stone, and Storm lay beside him, head resting gently on his leg. Down in the valley, the herd ran free, no reins, no riders. Just wind and instinct. Elias watched them, one by one. The three-legged horse now ran with an offbeat rhythm. But it ran. The one blind in one eye still followed its companion, like it had never known darkness. Elias said nothing, but in his eyes glowed a light, only seen in those who are about to complete something far greater than themselves. If I die tomorrow, he murmured, this story, it will still be told. No need for my name. No need for a gravestone. Just one horse running past. And someone, somewhere, stopping to ask, where did that one come from? That day, Elias rode Storm for the last time. No reins, no saddle, only wind and memory. In the open field, he dismounted, unclipped the worn leather strap that had followed Storm through every mile, held it one last time, and dropped it to the ground. This time, I won't hold you back. Storm looked at Elias, eyes bright, but didn't rush. Then he turned, walked, and began to run. At first, slow, then faster, until he lifted from the earth, as if pain itself couldn't hold him anymore. The herd ahead parted, then welcomed him in. No judgment, no past to weigh him down. Storm rejoined the wild, as if he'd never left. Elias remained still. His hands didn't tighten. His eyes didn't blink. Because some souls, when released, become even stronger. And some bonds need no words to know. They were never truly broken. Evening fell. Elias lay back on the bench beneath the porch. The air was gentle, but he pulled a thin blanket over his chest. Eyes half closed. On the hill, Storm stood. No one called, but he came. The wind scattered dust around him. Light sliced between his upright ears, and his eyes watched Elias, unmoving. No whinny, no gallop, but that gaze was immortality. The only thing left, after everything else had been lost, and there was nothing more that needed to be said. Elias spoke the words during the first gathering of volunteers at the sanctuary. They say I saved a horse, but the truth is, he saved the part of me I thought had died. No one clapped. They simply sat in stillness, as if something deep within them had just been stirred awake. Elias lifted his gaze, looked out across the open prairie. Not everything abandoned is lost. Sometimes, those very things save the best of what's left in us. He stepped away from the circle, quietly walking back toward the porch. And right then, Storm approached. Not quickly, not in a rush. His muzzle touched gently against Elias's chest, right where Elias had once pressed his hand to Storm's heart. Long ago. A soft touch, but enough to make Elias stop. He didn't speak, just bowed his head and placed a hand on Storm's forehead, like a promise that had never truly left. The evening light spilled across the prairie. Storm stood tall, his mane catching the wind, his eyes looking into the distance. Not at Elias, but beyond, toward the reader, toward you. A gaze that asked for nothing, didn't accuse, didn't demand, only whispered, "Do you still believe in the part of you that's still human? And if one day you feel like you have nothing left worth holding on to, remember, if even one soul still remembers you, it's enough." They say he saved a horse, but no, it was the horse who saved the part of him he once buried alive. That horse, forgotten, beaten, discarded, was the very soul patient enough to wait for him to return. And if one day you feel like there's nothing left worth holding on to, remember this. Sometimes, just one soul remembering you is enough. Because often, It's the small things we once let go of that help us find ourselves again. This story isn't just about a man and a horse. It's about you. About me. About all the souls that have cracked, fallen silent, but never completely faded. Because forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's having the courage to walk back and let the part of us that still remains live again. If this story stirred something in you, leave a comment or share it with someone who once felt forgotten. Gallop of Glory will keep telling stories like these. Not so you can watch, but so you can remember.